My name is Jennifer Llewellyn. I'm a professor at Dalhousie Law School in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And I teach and work in the area of restorative justice, in constitutional law, and domestic and international human rights law. I got to what I am doing now, I guess, through a couple of paths. Partly the way that I grew up. I grew up in a family with a father who was a United Church minister and a mother who was very active in social justice issues. And so I grew up as a kid learning about poverty and social justice issues and nuclear disarmament and political causes, and they were central for me to what it meant to be faithful. It was more about how we live in the world and how we show people that it matters, that we're here together, and that we can do better things together and treat people in a better way. So I think I kind of grew up as a little kid that way, and that structured what I was interested in and passionate about, and went off to university and started to study philosophy, and very quickly became interested in applied philosophy, which was, why does it matter to the world? And found myself passionately interested in ideas and how important they were for what we do. That ideas are really important, not for their own sake, but because they help us talk about what we do, they help us imagine what we can do, they help us think about where we can go. But found my life as a grad student in philosophy not leaving me a lot of space to think about those ideas in the context of why they matter to the world. And so I was had always been drawn to ideas of justice and to ideas of how we relate to one another and how we live together in the world of philosophy, and found that maybe the best place to marry those ideas for me was in law, because that was a place, at least that I thought, ought to care maybe more than it does about justice and the power of law to be a vehicle for social change and for helping us be who we want to be together in the world. So I went to law school, discovered that's not wholly what law school's about. In fact, that's not really what law school's about. And then, oddly enough, chose to stay at a law school because one thing that I did grasp while I was there was that there was incredible potential and possibility to be thinking in deeper ways and in more fulsome ways about the power of law as a vehicle for social change, about what justice had to do with law, and about how we might imagine it more broadly, and that it was an incredible incubator, law school itself, of students who walked in the door full of hope and possibility of what they wanted to do with their law school degree. And I sort of slowly watched my colleagues and friends make choices that felt ever more constrained and ever more narrow and limiting from the sort of dreams and ideas that they had when they came in. And that even when they were in those sort of narrower pockets of law, they found themselves caught up in what's most important for that area of law without seeing its potential to contribute to what they were passionate about in the world. And so I think maybe that's what drew me to stay working in a law school, was that I wanted to be able to be part of legal education in a way that, if I could, for a few students, provided some space for them to think of this as a place that they didn't have to abandon the ideals that they walked in the door with. And that ideals are important to law. And they're important because law is a powerful social and political institution. And these young people had innumerous possibilities to do what they do in a way that they're passionate about and in a way that brings goodness in a sort of an idyllic sense to the world. So in large measure, the work that I do at law school is related to my conviction about justice. And I mean that at a theoretical level, and then that has implications for the way that we ought to be doing justice and the way in which law and legal systems seek to be responding to those needs. And so for me, that was a journey in part influenced by my early days in philosophy. I was really interested in feminist philosophy and in particular ideas in feminist philosophy about who we are as human beings, who we are as human selves. And in part that was because the story, the more traditional story that's influential in our world about the liberal human being, the liberal self, the ideal of the individuated person who can pull themselves up by their bootstrap needs rights to protect themselves from others as swords and shields, and our criminal system of justice that says, really what we ought to be about in protecting ourselves is finding the bad apples and the individuals that are to blame and punishing them and putting them in prison where we're protected from them, didn't seem to resonate with what I thought we needed to be doing in the world, didn't seem to resonate with my experience of life, which was heavily influenced by others and heavily connected by others, and didn't seem to be serving us particularly well in terms of the kinds of social institutions that we were structuring, and particularly the kind of legal institutions we were structuring. And so I started being interested in relational theory, which gave some way of articulating these beliefs about the fact that maybe we are actually fundamentally connected to one another, that at our core, we need others. We develop who we are, our sense of self, our ambitions, our capacity to make choices for ourselves, our ability to be who we are in relationship with others and through our relationships with others. And so that's not to say that we don't make our own choices, that we don't have agency, that we aren't individuals, but it is to say we're not individuated, we're not separate from, and then we ought not to pretend that we are. And I don't think it's a very radical notion in the sense that I think all of us would look around our lives and say that that's true. We're not just the sum of the parts of our relationships, the sum of our relationships. We're more than that. But we can't imagine who we are without taking account of those connections. And without taking account of the fact that as human beings, we are socially connected to others. We're inherently social beings. So that's not actually a radical notion, I think, about the way that we understand ourselves. But we don't live that way. And our law is not structured that way. And we don't structure our social institutions that way. We actually, live a lie at some level in that we imagine this ideal of ourselves as separate from others. Right? That's what we think free choices are. They're unfettered by others. That's what we think our rights are for. That's what we imagine to be the ideal of the person we're imagining that we've built these systems for. And I guess I kind of came to the conclusion that it's probably no wonder that they fail us. And as I looked around and saw various reform efforts that happen within the justice sphere and lots of other social spheres, often those reform efforts, those really creative spaces people are trying to wedge open within institutions, are motivated by trying to create space for real people and who we really are and what we really need from one another inside of an institution that alienates us from one another. And so while it's not a really radical notion, this idea of a relational idea of the self, I think it is a notion that might have some radical implications for how we would do things differently. It's not, I don't think it's an idea that says none of the goals and the ideas that we've developed through our liberal democracies are valuable. In fact, I think lots of them are valuable, but it does tell us something different about how we might achieve them together. I think we do have lots of the right aspirations. We do have lots of the right ideas about how we need to be protecting folks who are most vulnerable, that we ought to be securing rights for people to be making choices about how they want to flourish and live in the world. But our systems don't get there the right way often, and it's because we don't ask the right questions, right? Which is not how can we be protected from one another, how can we be separate from one another, but what are the right kinds of connections? Once you get that we're relational beings, you know that we can be made and flourish and successful through relationships, or we can be unmade by them and destroyed by them. And so we need to pay very careful attention to structuring the right kinds of connections in the world with one another. We need to ask questions about what do our human rights need to be such that they allow us to have these right kinds of connections. And I think it's not kind of a radical notion for us about what those connections are. I think we know in our soul the kinds of connections that don't work. And we know from our experience the kind of connections that don't work. Violence, oppression, all those sorts of structures of connection between people don't allow people to flourish. In fact, they're often described as self-destructive or destructive of the self, even if they don't kill the person, right? And from that, we can generate the kinds of baseline qualities we need to have in connection with one another if we're going to be able to be sort of fully ourselves and realize our potential. And their dignity, respect, and concern for the other, equal concern, right? That's what's going to protect our equal moral worth. That's what's going to create the sorts of connections between people that can allow us to flourish and live peacefully together.